saying, it is remarkable to see the scale of what is going on in Kherson. Of course, many of these reports are unconfirmed at this stage, but it seems like the Russians are once again messing this up.
Yes, I think that's right. I think, Tom, we've got to put it in the widest perspective. The original Russian plan, going back to earlier in the year, had been to capture Kherson, which they did, and then push through Mykolaiv towards Odessa to threaten Moldova. And that was what they really wanted to do. Well, frankly, that has failed. And we've seen over recent months the Ukrainian strength building. We saw their remarkable counterattack in Kharkiv in the north, and we've seen the significant progress that they've made in Kherson. Now, what we saw a couple of days ago was this rather extraordinary performance between the Russian commander and the defense minister going through a rather choreographed discussion on television when the permission was given to withdraw from Kherson. So that's the Russian plan, and I think that's what they intend to do. They, if they can pull it off, would like to withdraw their forces to east of the Dnipro River and then really hold that fortified position. Now, the big question is, can they actually do that? Because, as you're reporting this morning, Ukrainian forces are pressing forward, albeit cautiously, liberated some 10, 12 villages in the last 36 hours. And there is the strong prospect that 15, 20,000 Russian troops are still on the west bank of the Dnipro River, and that the Russians may have a real problem in getting them back over the river. Many of the bridges have been dropped by Ukrainian artillery, so the Russians may be forced to using barges and floating ferries to try and get those troops across. Now, here's a question. Will the Ukrainians pause and allow that to happen, or will they follow up really hard and fast with artillery and infantry and armour and aim to capture those 20,000 soldiers? They may well do that. Then there's the wider issue, is all this a trap? Actually, I don't think it is a trap as such. I think it is a logical withdrawal on the part of the Russians to a much more defensible position on the east side of the Dnipro River. However, Kherson, the city itself, is on the west side. I have no doubt at all that the Russians, as they withdraw, are preparing booby traps, mines, every possible device to make life impossible in Kherson. Bear in mind they've moved out 70,000 of the civilians, probably mostly originally Russian-speaking and Russian-focused civilians. So Kherson is probably going to become, quite shortly, in Ukrainian hands, but frankly, a ghost city.
Yes, and I suppose that follows the Russian playbook in many other parts of the world where, frankly, they flatten places rather than hand them over, or indeed flatten them to take them. But what does this say about where the war is going? Because, of course, winter is setting in, and if there's one lesson that we must have learnt in the last 200 years of fighting in this part of the world, it's that winter is where invasions or counter-invasions really get stuck in Russia or indeed in Ukraine. Should we learn the lessons of what happened in the 1940s and indeed what happened in Napoleon's escapades in this part of the world as well? Things will basically freeze, things will basically stay still until it gets a bit warmer.
Tom, you're right. You're mostly right. But I think there's one other aspect of this. The change seasons, autumn and spring, are the wet seasons, when this very open country becomes extraordinarily muddy and very difficult to move in. And that's what they're going through at the present moment. I think it's miserable to be a soldier in either the Russian or the Ukrainian army at the present time. Even more miserable in the Russian army because the Ukrainians have got better boots, they've got better equipment, they've got better wet weather clothing. So the Ukrainians are suffering less than the Russians are in this very wet and muddy conditions. Now, in a few weeks, a month or so's time, the temperature will drop, the ground will harden up again, and manoeuvre will be possible. It won't be much fun because it'll be blooming cold, ice and snow, but those who have got better equipment will be able to move more easily. I think, though, what is going to happen around Kherson is that on that front, things are going to solidify quite shortly. The Russians will adopt well-defended positions on the east bank of the Dnipro River, 200-300 meters wide. The Ukrainians will struggle to get through Kherson itself because of all the obstacles and the mines. And then they've got the major problem do they or don't they try an assault river crossing across the Dnipro to attack the Russians? Personally, well, I know that would be an extraordinarily difficult phase of war, very difficult operation of war. It will cause huge casualties. And I think that the Ukrainians will pause long and hard before doing that. If they want to continue their offensive, they would be better, in my view, to continue it in the north of the country, getting into the Donbass that way, and maybe over time trying to get behind the Russians again in their well-defended position on the Dnipro River.